And if we return to this slide, it's important for us to understand that because there is political turmoil, there are a lot of funds being directed toward facing that political conflict and trying to stabilize the political situation. Money being diverted to political situations and military fighting means less money and less imperial commissions for artworks celebrating the Roman state. So as Christianity is becoming more and more popular, especially in the West, governmental power is becoming less and less of a factor in terms of artistic production in the West at the same time. So as one is lessening, the other is increasing. So there still are commissions for the government. They're just much smaller scale, much less impressive, and there's much less money being dedicated to those. So when we look at the artworks of this period, we see that there are very few artworks before the legalization of Christianity, and we've already mentioned that idea. One thing that we haven't talked about yet, though, is that there was a lot of hesitancy to create large-scale freestanding sculptures. And the Christians were really worried about those sculptures being confused with idol worship. So they just preferred to avoid that medium overall. There are a few very small examples from the early Christian period of large-scale sculpture, but for the most part, it really just dies out. And that's going to remain the case all the way until we get to the Renaissance. Sculpture on a large scale in the medieval period, when we do have it, is attached to a church. It's not freestanding. It's not until the Renaissance that we see this really make reemergence. Now, we already talked quite a bit about how less classical styles were becoming more accepted. We talked about the political turmoil of the age and how those border areas and fringe areas of the empire had more power, that they had a preference for less classical styles. We talked about the need for government to appeal to more Romans as an audience, even including the poor. The poor liked the less classical style, even including early Christians who liked the less classical style, and of course those fringe areas that we just mentioned who had a preference for the less classical style. When Christianity rolls around, what's going to happen is that is just going to be cemented in place and even heightened. So yes, we already were moving towards less classicism. Christianity comes on the scene and they heavily prefer a non-classical style. And so we have really kind of cemented our direction there in art. There are a couple of reasons why the early Christians preferred to move away from classicism. If we look down at this last bullet point, it kind of summarizes them for you. The first thing is that the classical style was closely associated with paganism. And that makes a lot of sense because think of all of the imperial commissions that were done for the church, and they were done in this very classical kind of style. So the style became associated with pagan belief. So of course for the Christians, they don't want to be associated with pagan belief, and so they want to avoid that style so they can avoid those same sorts of connotations. Another reason that the Christians preferred a non-classical style was that they felt like when works were very believable and very classical and naturalistic, that made them closer to being idols and closer to graven imagery and idol worship. If they simplified things and made it less believable and less naturalistic, they felt like those ideas of idolatry were less likely to be connected with the artworks. So that's another reason. And then, of course, the last reason, perhaps the most significant of these, Christian artworks really were meant to speak to the viewer on a spiritual level. They were meant to teach spiritual lessons, to inspire spiritual awe. And the Christians felt like if they created a work of art that was classical, it would be very physical, right? Because classical works look like our physical world. They're believable, they're naturalistic. The physical is obviously opposite from the spiritual. So for Christians who want to focus on the spiritual rather than the physical, they choose to avoid that very classical, believable style because it is such a physical type of style. So we were already headed towards less classicism. Christianity comes on the scene. For these reasons, avoiding associations with paganism, avoiding idolatry, and trying to connect with the spiritual, they continue to prefer that less classical style, and it becomes even more extreme. Those are all ideas that you would want to talk about on an essay that would be geared toward explaining early Christian art and architecture. You'd want to explain why they start to reject the classical tradition and move towards something that's less classical overall. Now, one thing that we need to remember, just like any change in artistic style, this does not happen overnight. So there are a lot of transitions happening in terms of artistic style for these artworks. We're still going to see some classical elements, sometimes some classical symbolism, sometimes space is very believable, or drapery. Even sometimes we'll get attention to the body, although that's less common. But these things are going to be tempered by combining them with non-classical elements. So if we're looking at that second to last bullet point, a lot of non-classical elements that are used in early Christian artworks include minimal detail, flat figures, so there's less modeling of the figures, they feel very flat. Space itself seems very flat. The figures don't have a sense of individualization, they don't have a sense of lifelike emotion, they're very still, they're very stoic, and they're usually just repeated faces over and over. Proportions are often inaccurate. Hieratic scale, our good friend, comes back and makes an appearance here. And there's a lot of stylization. So you're familiar with a lot of these terms already. These aren't new things in art. We've seen them before. But the Christians are kind of making a comeback with those. One other thing that we want to talk about in general in terms of artistic style for these works is that they're often used for didactic purposes. So I know we went a little bit out of order from the bullet points here. We're going to go back up to that fourth bullet point. These are the functions of early Christian art in general. This is something, again, you'd want to bring up on an essay question talking about early Christian art and architecture. What does didactic mean? It means that it's meant to teach something. So they're trying to teach Christian doctrines, Christian stories to their worshipers. A lot of the works are meant for funerary purposes, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we see examples. So they have, decoration for a tomb or a sarcophagus, something like that's very common for these early Christian works. And of course, also very common is the fact that many of these works of art are used to decorate the churches. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about what they do in the interiors of Christian churches when we get to our example of Old St. Peter's. They're going to spend a lot of time creating a really elaborate interior that's meant to be otherworldly and meant to be spiritual for those viewers. So those are the characteristics here of artworks in general. And for architecture, we're going to see that religious structures are going to be built more often than public works. So that's a change from the Roman period where we had the emperors right there in Rome creating immense amounts of works of architecture for public use. Now we're going to see religious structures really coming to the fore in terms of what's constructed. And that makes sense because unlike the earlier pagan religions, Christians worshiped together indoors. So they needed large, open meeting places for their worship services. And since Christianity is growing, those churches keep getting full and full and full and full, and they keep constructing new churches to accommodate all of these new converts. So lots of religious structures being built during this time period. What they choose to do in terms of how the structure is created is they choose to use a basilica plan. And remember that Roman basilica was like a civic structure, kind of a judicial structure. It was not as associated with the Roman religion as something like a Roman temple would have been. And because the Catholics want to avoid those associations with any sort of paganism, they are choosing a secular type of structure that they can now move forward without having any kinds of connections with paganism. So they use the basilica as their floor print, and they're going to modify that slightly. We'll talk about that when we get to the example. And like the Romans before them, they're going to be pretty plain on the exteriors. lots of just brick exteriors without a ton of decoration. But when they get to the interiors, there are just an incredible amount of artworks and precious materials to create this spiritual kind of atmosphere. They use a lot of gold. They feel like gold is a symbol of heaven. They use a lot of mosaics, and I'll kind of explain to you what a mosaic is when we see an example. Mosaics are made out of glass most often at this period. Romans did mosaics too, but they usually did mosaics out of stone. The early Christians like to do them out of glass because they're very reflective of the light. And if you look kind of downward, you've got that last hash mark underneath this bullet point that says when those mosaics reflected the light, not only did it make the interior of the church kind of glittery and mystical, but early Christians often associated God with light. They felt like light was this kind of embodiment of God's divinity. So reflecting all of that light through a mosaic kind of put the presence of God inside their structures. And many decorative elements often included in these interiors as well. One thing that we'll talk quite a bit about is that they didn't choose the church locations just by default, but they chose them according to something that we call the cult of saints. The cult of saints is a following of the early Catholic saints. I know the word cult has a lot of negative connotations for us in our society today, but at this point in history, it just means people who are interested in the saints. They're not brainwashed or anything, they're just interested in the saints. They're interested in seeing places where miraculous things occurred for these saints, or visiting places where the saints lived, or seeing objects that the saints touched. So when they're choosing locations for these early Christian churches, they're very often choosing locations that were important in the lives of certain saints. Sometimes near a site where a saint had been buried, for instance, is very common. So they choose those locations according to a cult of saints. And as we said, simple exteriors. They're using Roman forms of engineering for the construction, sometimes arches or arcades, sometimes columns, but they're really less invested in engineering at this point in history. So usually the buildings are a little more simplistic. All right, we're going to talk about some of these terms down here listed in the last bullet point. When we see our example, these are terms that you'd want to include on your question that asks about early Christian art and architecture. Right, realize that we're talking about both art and architecture in that question. And we will see a slide with all of these elements identified later on. Our first example comes from a city called Dura Europos in Syria. And it's often called the Pompeii of the desert. It was a city that was very popular in the early Christian era before it was legalized. And it was actually a haven for many different forms of religious beliefs. But eventually it kind of gets filled in by sand and just is buried by sand for hundreds and hundreds of years and is really not found until the 1920s. So everything's pretty well preserved. Here, when we look at this image of Samuel anointing the prophet David, sorry for that typo there on the title, this comes from some of those wall paintings that were done in the structures there at Dura Europos. You can see that we're starting to incorporate that less classical style. We've got less believable portrayal of space, right? The feet are pointed down instead of out toward us. The figures seem more flat because there's less modeling. We also have some stylization. If we're looking at the drapery especially, you can clearly see that some of that is less believably cascading and is more stylized. We have a sense of frontality. The faces are generic and repetitive. There are very few emotions. And we also have hieratic scale returning. So you can see that overall the style here is pretty non-classical. Even the space is very shallow. All of these things show to us this preference the early Christians had for that non-classical style. Remember, they don't want to be associated with paganism. They don't want to be associated with idol worship. And they want to focus on the spiritual message of what's happening here in the scene. All of these are reasons that they chose that less classical style. Now, what's really fascinating is some of these earlier examples before Christianity was legalized are even less classical than some of the examples that happened after the legalization of Christianity. Part of that is due to the influx of patrons that we get once Christianity is legalized, patrons that are familiar with the classical Roman tradition and continue to incorporate a little bit of that with the less classical approach of the Christians.